Good evening, church.
Good evening.
Welcome to Bible study here at Christ the King on Thursday nights. Today, we're going to talk about Passover. We actually passed over the story of Passover last week because I wanted to give you the narrative of the plagues and how Moses and the Israelites leave Egypt. And we had just talked that last week about how all of those plagues happen in 6, 7, and 8 and 9, and then in 13 and 14, they start to leave Egypt. Well, we skipped over Passover for two reasons. One, it deserves its own conversation, and two, it's added later. It's added later. Remember, we talked a little bit about how once they got into the promised land, Moses and Miriam sing songs, thanking God for all that they've been delivered from and to. Freedom is not just freedom from, it's freedom to. There's a promise, there's a hope on the horizon of a land from milk and honey. So you go from an existence where all you do is make bricks, where you are a slave, you have no freedom and no choice, you have freedom from that, but you also have a freedom to a land of milk and honey. Now, of course, we've talked about there is no such thing as a land where milk and honey flow. Milk and honey come from animals, right? But it comes from an ecosystem in which you are an active participant, a joyful active participant, not one of making bricks, which is really just hard labor. And right after they sing songs, everyone starts complaining. This was the last slide that I showed you last time. And this complaining goes on all of the chapters that we're really going to fly over here between this lecture and the next one, is all of the complaining chapters where nothing's good enough, and every time they go somewhere, they say, we're hungry, we're thirsty, and they all turn into 4-year-olds all over again, like my girl Berkeley here. Yep. Well, we skipped over 11 and 12. And that's because I want to show you how these stories, the story of Passover, when you put it side by side, 11 and 12, you can notice that 12 is 11 with some additions. So look at this. Look at the discrepancies here. About midnight, this is God saying what's going to happen with the 10th plague and the destroying of the firstborn. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the female slave, who is behind the handmill, and the firstborn of the livestock, meaning all the cow firstborns. And there will be a loud cry throughout the whole land of Egypt, just as never been, nor will ever be again. Now, if you remember from the very end of our first lecture and the beginning of our second lecture, we said that God intervened in the story of Exodus because he heard the cries of his people, right? So that same God, of course, theologically, they're trying to understand God as an emotionally complex human, because that's what they know, right? We tend to create God out of our image, not the other way around. And they imagine God as hearing one people's cry and making another people cry. Theologically, that's very interesting. That's not really the way that I would think about God. That's not the way I would suggest that you think about God. God hates some people crying and enjoys other people crying. I don't know about you, but anybody crying is a little bit of a problem for me, right? Because you want to cry with them or something. That's really can be really, really tough. For me, it never fails. I've had a tough time at home with the kids, and one of them's, as a parent, you're only as happy as your least happy child, right? And then it's time to switch, or it's time for me to go to work, and I'll be there in a coffee shop, and all I want is quiet, and there'll be a child there just screaming or crying their eyes out, and it's always when I'm not ready to have empathy, and you're just like, are you kidding me? So this idea of God who can make people cry is a really sort of eye for an eye vengeful way of looking at God and really, of course, looking at themselves. But all of this will be the loudest cry that ever there was. And then right below it, but a dog won't even bark for the Israelites. Okay? Now, we're going to be separated here by, let's say, 1/10 of a mile, right? Between the barracks of the Israelites in slavery and the houses of the Pharaoh and all of his people. The loudest cry that's ever been, and not even a dog is going to bark. Now, I don't know about you, but I ain't never been in a neighborhood that had dogs where none of them were barking, right? But the notion is that the Egyptians will be so overwhelmed with God's destruction for them. And yet, in the land of the Israelites, God will give them total peace, right? So that's theologically, I think that's really interesting. So that you may know the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all of the officials of yours shall come down to me and bow down to me. This is Moses channeling God's voice and then talking to Pharaoh as Moses. Come to me and bow down to me, Moses, because I represent God. Remember how we talked about how God sends Moses, who sends Aaron, right, to be his person. Yeah. Yeah, so Ralph said all these officials. So whenever Moses and Aaron get an audience with Pharaoh, all of Pharaoh's entourage are there too. All of those priests that they did the thing with the snakes in front of and all that, all of those people, that he's talking to all of them. And that comes up again in a little bit. All the people that bow down to Pharaoh are there. All of the yes men. Yeah, but they're also priests, okay? Now, none of that language in 11 says you have to do anything with blood. It doesn't say that the Israelites have to do anything that God already knows who the Egyptians are and who the Israelites are. You see that that's not in that story, okay? Whenever we've got two stories side by side, and the one that's literally written, that shows up second in the text, has the same words, but a lot of other stuff, we always assume, probably correctly, that was added, that's the second story. So here's the second retelling of this story, okay? Notice here, at midnight I will go through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. Does it say that Yahweh will kill the people? It just says that I will go through and they will die, okay? How they die is left up to the imagination, okay? God passes through in darkness, passes through like the shadow of the valley of death, right? But once you get to 12, all of that's been very clear, okay? So this would be an acquittal for God in a courtroom, right? Did you do it? I can tell you I was there, but you can't prove that I did it, okay? But now look at this. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt. Okay, well, that's a little more clear, right? God's going away in a courtroom here for what happens here. Both human beings and animals, all of the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. Now, that's an interesting phrase, okay? Here, Ralph noticed, this one is all of your officials will bow down to me. This one says all of the gods of Egypt will bow down to me. Now, you know a good amount now about how to read these different traditions, J, E, D, and P. Who's going to write that God's going to smite down all the other gods? The priests, right? So this starts to become so that's your first hint that this is priestly. And then what 12 is going to do here is say, the Lord shall be, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Then 12 launches into all of the things that you should do properly when you're celebrating Passover. Not the original, okay? Not that first time, but every other time since then, here's how you should do. You should get a lamb that's 1 year old. And if you are too small of a family to be able to afford a lamb, go to your nearest neighbor and get one with them. And you should cook it not in a pot of water. You should cook it over the fire with everything still inside of it. You haven't taken anything out of it. You take the blood, you smear it on your doorpost, you eat it. If there's anything left in the morning, you have to burn it. All of those things feel like priestly things that aren't intended for the story as it first happened. They're intended for the remembrance of the story as it first happened. And we believe that probably anybody reading this in, say, the 7th century, the 6th century BCE, would understand that it's one of those cutouts, right? So, like when you read a textbook, it'll be text, 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 and then there'll be a box, and it's shaded, and it's a different color, and it's like, did you know, ... and then there's a bunch of stuff, right? So we should know that we've inserted a recipe for how to carry out the Passover in the middle of the story. The problem is, we're, for whatever reason, not supposed to read Scripture like adults. For whatever reason, we were all taught just to take the story as one narrative flow, and then we get upset when it doesn't make sense to us, because it doesn't make sense to that. And if all you had was words and you didn't have, like I just explained to you, a pictograph, right, where there was a shaded background, if you didn't have different colors or different fonts or borders or anything like that, it just comes out as a bunch of words, really just a bunch of letters, really just a bunch of consonants in a row. It's hard to parse out. But if you look at it close enough, I hope now you can clearly see this is the same story, but being told differently. This is the story of how the Egyptians got what was coming to them, and this is the story about how you should liturgically and worshipfully remember the story of Passover. You with me? Okay. I just put these up there to make sure that I said all these when we were doing that other thing. The 10th plague, which is actually chapter 11, is about Egypt being brought to justice. They will cry out like never before. There's no Passover. There's no mention of blood or manna. By the way, manna also shows up in chapter 12, but not here in 11. It's a plague. There's no mention of how the firstborns die, other than that God comes through and then they die. And Moses leaves in righteous anger. I left that part out. But Moses leaves very angry, which is the same word that God used when Moses was being annoying at the burning bush. Yeah. She's asking if the P source is chapter 12, what source is chapter 11? It's hard to parse out J and E. J is the Yahwist source and E is the Elohim source, but it's probably J. Some people think it's E. Some people think there is no E, that it's all J-E or just J. But the Yahwehist source is a God who walks among us. Yahweh always walks among you. That's how you know you're talking about Yahweh. When we get to the very end of Exodus, and there's that whole, oh, God, I want to see you, right? Well, you can't see me, but I'll walk by, right? That's J, okay? When Adam and Eve are in the garden, and they find that they're naked, and they hear God walking in the garden, so they hide, that's J. So, and then right after, in Exodus, right when Moses says, God walked past me, and God walks past me, the very next line, which was written by the priest, says, as you can see, no one has ever seen God, right? like they have to put an extra point on there. So this idea that God is going to come down, I will go out. I don't know why I'm putting it on this one back here. You can't see that. I will go out through Egypt. That has that same resonance of I will walk among you. Yes, that's it. Yeah, Pam.
Just a question.
Yeah.
You were talking about the flow. Even as a hyperbole, I never quite understood how the story, just a couple plagues ago, all the Egyptian livestock died.
Yeah.
And now the firstborn are going to die of the livestock. But they don't
Right.
have any livestock because they just all died.
Right. Right. So Pam's saying all of the livestock died, and now we're saying that only the firstborn are going to die, 3 plagues later or whatever it is. Yeah, only the firstborn will die. So historically, if there's a historic underlying to the story that we're telling, the narrative that we're telling, if something like this happened, I think there's a good chance that something like this happened. Maybe it happened over 10 years, right? And finally, at the end of it, when the firstborn of, maybe not all, but maybe the firstborn of Pharaoh died, right? What if Pharaoh said, oh, I'm worried about an uprising, you should kill all these firstborns. One survived somehow, and that one came back and said, you need to let my people go. My God says you need to let my people go, or else your firstborn's going to die. And then the Pharaoh's firstborn died because, infant mortality, right? Then he could say, oh, over the last 10 years, there's been crazy stuff. We had a famine, the cows died, we had ticks and locusts and yada, yada. I think this God might have been at play here, and I'm going to send them off. But you're exactly right. The narrative of boom, 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 that fits we want to take a really good book, and condense it down to a 2-hour movie. It fits our timeline of like how we like things to happen, but the way they tell stories are, and then Moses was 678. Like that's the way. Wait till I tell you about the death of Moses. That's man. There's crazy stuff in these scriptures, and they all have to do with sex for some reason. I don't understand. Okay, so Moses leaves in righteous anger, and that's how 11 ends, and then the newer version 12, of course, goes into the elaborate detail about how we should remember Passover. I told you that God calls out the gods of Egypt, which is actually, remember the 3 audiences? There's us, there's the audience that it was written about, and there's the time in which it was written. The time in which it was written is almost the most interesting one, almost all the time, and they're the ones that we think least about when we read a text. But the time in which this was written, of course, there are a bunch of other tribes in the promised land, the land of milk and honey, where they are, when it's written. And of course, there are all these other gods for them to worship. And so they keep coming back to the thou shalt have no other gods. And so the later version would probably definitely include, and I wiped out all those gods of Egypt. I put them to shame. Again, their religion isn't totally monotheistic as we imagine it is. It's that their God is supreme. There are other gods, as you can see in the language here. The firstborns are definitely killed by God, and it talks about giving your firstborn lamb to God. I didn't want to put all that text up there because I know I can see your eyes glaze over when I actually show you the Bible. So just to talk about it, then it says, in order to observe the Passover, you shall take a firstborn lamb, right? The first fruits of everything belong to God, including the first of the womb, of every womb. That includes your firstborn child, should be dedicated to God. Do you remember in Luke's gospel, Jesus and his mother go to the temple on his 8th day, and they meet Ananias and Zachariah. Simeon. Thank you. And in that then that part they're doing the dedication, right? So that's what's being asked here, is that the firstborn be dedicated. And this is an aside, but it's an important. I almost put this in, but I think it's really important. The word that's used there is exchange. So if you're not rich enough to afford the lamb, the firstborn lamb of dedication, you can exchange it for 2 turtle doves, right? Which is what happens when Jesus goes to the temple. Well, why is that important? Because that language of exchange finds its way into the Lamb of God theology that becomes the exchange language for how they talk about how Jesus saves us from our sins, which is actually an inappropriate use of that. The exchange language that they're using is like, here's a recipe, and if you don't, I never have whatever the recipe calls for, right? It's like not vanilla extract, but it'll be like vanilla sugar. And you're like, I don't even know what that is. I can't even find that in a grocery store. And they're like, well, if you can't find this, you can put in a substitute of something that's close to that, okay? That's the language that shows up in Exodus. But when Mark and Luke and Matthew, John doesn't really care, when Mark, Luke, and Matthew are reading those texts, they're reading Hebrew texts that have been translated into Greek, and in the translation, they lose the meaning that exchange was simply how you observe it, and they use that word, and the word that shows up in Mark 16 is not exchange, it's ransom. He came to be a ransom for our lives, okay? That feels like God is a kidnapper, right? Ransom, we literally only use the word ransom when it comes to kidnapping, right? Can you think of another use of that word? But the word here that actually is a substitute. So it's not so much that when we think about Lamb of God as Jesus, it's not that he's a substitute for what they call penal substitution, that he takes our sins. That's actually missing the narrative, which is really about how you give your best to God. And if you don't have $1 million, you give God $1,000, right? So it wasn't quite about, okay. Anyway, I just think that's important for you to know. It gets translated later as ransom. Great story, bro, I know. There's a reason I didn't put it in, and there's also a reason why I think it's important. So Passover is a worship. It's a worship story. So worship, they don't have fancy buildings with acoustical tiles and projectors. All they have are stories that you can live out at home, okay? If you read Exodus and then you read the generation later's version of Exodus, that's like when they take a movie or an idea like Westworld, right, was an old thing, and now it's a new thing, right? That's what happens when Exodus becomes Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the same story of Exodus, but a generation later, 20 years later, they rewrite Exodus and they call it Deuteronomy. And in it, they're having this fight about where should you sacrifice, where should you celebrate Passover? Should you just do it at home, or should it be in the temple? And Deuteronomy says, you can't do that. You can't do that at home, okay? You are not licensed to do that at home. You can only do it in the temple, right? So it's the same story, but played out. But in the Exodus story, Passover is something that you do at home because you need to remember where you came from. And I have to say, this story is still very compelling. It's very compelling for us. Even though we don't identify with Jewish ancestry, the fact is, in this story, not all the people who escaped slavery that day were of Jewish ancestry, right, or latter Jewish ancestry, but we're a mixed group. All people, somewhere in your lineage, you've been a slave. You've been oppressed. You've been abused. And somewhere in your future, you will be a slave or oppressed or abused again, or your descendants will. And this is a story of how you remember what it was like to be captive and that you appreciate the freedom that you have. That's what this story is about. Blood and unleavened bread are here to tell the story. And the text from Exodus says, this will be a day of remembrance for you. They give you like the month and the day, but those don't mean anything for us, so I left them off. This will be a day of remembrance for you. Okay, so what's happening here? What do these two things mean? The lamb, why would we put that on our doorpost? And the bread, why would we have crappy bread when we have good bread? We can make good bread. Why do we go to unleavened bread? So I'd like to take a minute to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what bread means and what blood means and what bread means. Blood, when you smear it on your door like that, shows how you participate in the community. Think about on Christmas Eve when you drive around Cary and there's the luminaria, right, lining the streets. If everybody does it, it's beautiful. If only one house does it, it's weird, right? It's not enough. I can tell that my neighborhood is getting older every year because there are fewer Christmas lights, right? You know who puts up Christmas lights? By and large, it's dads, right? Whose kids are like, you need to put up Christmas lights. And you're like, well, it's not really, I don't really care. I mean, whatever. I got to remember to unplug it every night. I got to walk out into the cold and unplug the darn thing every night. Kids don't ever see that. They're asleep. They're happy asleep in bed, right? But when you participate in the blood on the door, you could look out and see, gosh, this is a big deal. And when we come together as a community and we do something together, it is a big deal. And if you're in my Enneagram class or if you've been paying attention to all the things we say about communion and community, when we come together, it is vastly more interesting than when we are singular. How many of you have tried to eat a piece of garlic in your life? Just straight up uncooked garlic? No. But we eat garlic every day with other things, right? We know that combining things makes them taste better, okay? How many of you could play a musical instrument like a cello and probably wouldn't because it doesn't sound not that it doesn't sound good, I don't want to say that. But if you're just playing 4 notes over again, it sounds like you're just playing 4 notes over again. But when you take that cello and you put it in an orchestra, those 4 notes play off and against the other ones. So we identify ourselves not just in our worship of God or my individual understanding of my relationship with God, but when we put blood on the door and we do it together, we're saying we believe together. Our faith becomes communal. And it also means we fear God. We don't use that a lot in the ELCA, but we probably should because Luther says it on every page. What does this mean? You should fear and love God, right? This means that they appreciate that God's action and activity is very powerful, and they could die tonight, right? That when we put blood on the door, we're saying this could be our last night. If we don't put blood on the door, our firstborn will die tonight, right? Tomorrow is promised to no one. When we put our blood on the door, it also means that we have killed our lamb, our prized lamb, right? Our firstborn, without blemish lamb. And we're going to eat it tonight, right? Because tomorrow is promised to no one. Tonight, we're going to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So when we celebrate the Passover, we're saying we can't keep saving things in this life for another day because tomorrow is promised. We have to live, tomorrow's promised to no one. We have to live in today. We have to enjoy this moment. We cannot put off reconciliation with our sisters and brothers. We cannot go to bed angry. We can't keep kicking cans down the road. Today has to be the day, every day, when we celebrate putting the lamb's blood, we remember that tomorrow we are running away from slavery. We're running away from the land we know, from our house. We're running away from Pharaoh. We're running away from our routines and our habits. And that is really hard. One of the hardest things for a pastor is to watch people stay in miserable places in life. Watching people stay in an abusive relationship. Or watching people stay in addiction. Or watching people stay in a loveless marriage. I have that conversation like 5 times a week because we're afraid of liberation. Because we're afraid of what happens if we don't have this routine, right? That we think that God's not going to give us a hopeful tomorrow. That today, all we can do is stay in this. But putting our blood on the door signals to everybody that we're living in the now. And for the people of Passover, of which we are in that community, it's a good reminder that sometimes you have to celebrate this meal with your family and friends. Sometimes you have to enjoy this day. And the other thing that they do in chapter 12 and later on in Exodus is eat manna, which is unleavened bread. And the story was that they left so quickly that they didn't have time to finish baking bread in order to leave it. It reminds me of Lord of the Rings. How many of you are into Lord of the Rings, right? They eat elven bread for like ever, right? Because it's all they got. And it's not great, but it'll survive. Actually, I have some friends who are backpackers, and he told me that backpackers carry dog food with them when they go. Because if you're in a horrible situation, you will eat dog food on day 10, right? Or day 5. But if you're just stuck for a couple of hours and you panic and you get hungry, you're not going to eat the dog food. It's got the protein that you need, but it doesn't have quite that sense of urgency to it. And for the people eating manna, it means that they are willing to leave now because now is the freedom, and they're not going to continue to cozy up to the empire. That it's bad enough that we would leave without baking our bread. And this shows up in the Gospels all the time, particularly in Luke, which we've been in this whole year. Jesus, I want to follow you, but can I first? Oh, not a good time, Jesus. Not really ready for you. Could you try me again tomorrow? Right? And the sense of urgency of the manna suggests not only do we belong in this community, where it says that they ran out with their trough full of the bread they didn't have time to add yeast to. And so they just sort of wrapped it up in a towel and they're running out the door, like breakfast for my kids every morning, right? And we're eating it in the car today and tomorrow and the next day, right? There's a sense of urgency there because we could always say, let's just wait for the bread to rise and then we'll go and then we'll leave. But the sense of urgency is the story. One of the most beautiful pieces of writing of all time is Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which you've heard me mention this last year. I know John was paying attention that day. And the letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King writes in jail in Birmingham, and it's an op-ed to the newspaper. And in it, he quotes miraculously, beautifully, like 12 or 15 different theologians accurately, including Martin Luther and Augustine and many, many others. He quotes him accurately from memory. He has no books. He's in a prison cell. But what we forget about that piece of writing was he wrote it to the white clergy. Because when he got arrested, a bunch of white clergy wrote a letter to the newspaper saying, you know, we're on the side of these civil rights people, but it's just not time, you know. Let's just wait for the time to be right when it's an easy ad. Right now, if we do it right now, it's going to upset a lot of things. We hadn't worked all that out. Just be patient, and we're going to solve your civil rights issue, right? Right, 100 years since slavery, right? Which, we just celebrated the 400th anniversary of slavery starting in the United States. And Martin Luther King writes poetically, it will never be time for you. It will never be time for the elite to let the poor find an equal ground. It'll never be urgent for you like it is for us. And it's urgent for us. It's urgent for us, right? A lot of the things that Dr. King says in his I Have a Dream speech have taken place. I mean, a lot of those things, the end of segregation in schools and in really everything. A lot of those things, a lot of the I Have a Dreams are starting to work out, and only because we took an urgency to it. And that's what's happening here. They have to leave their home that the night before, they put blood on the door, and it protected them. Last night, they slept soundly while justice happened to their enemies. And just this morning, they're going to leave that home and go wander in the desert to follow some faint future hope of a promised land. That is a powerful story. And it's a reminder that the promise to follow God is simultaneously, somehow, safety and adventure. Somehow, when we tell the story of blood and also unleavened bread, we're telling the story about how God keeps us safe from harm, and also that God challenges us not to be complacent to the empire, that it's God who provides us safety, not the empire. It's God who made sure that they were safe that night, not Pharaoh. And when you confuse those two things, you are much more likely to stay in a bad situation, to say, oh, it's just not that bad, until you realize it's God who keeps you safe. And it's also God who calls you out of Egypt and into the promised land. Without activity of leaving one situation, they will never be able to find what God is calling them to do in the new place. Passover is worship. It's a worship service. It's a way of telling the story. And so I've got a little bit more biblical text for you, okay? Let's just give me 2 minutes to not fall asleep on this one. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign. This is a continuation of 12. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. Where I see blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance to you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. You can see how the audience, right, is actually of the author. It's the time in which the author is writing. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day shall be cut off from Israel. Only a priest would say, if you put leaven in your bread, you are cut off from Israel. God does not love you. A lot of Enneagram 1s in the priestly code here, writing these stories. On the first day you shall hold a solemn assembly, and on the seventh day a solemn assembly. No work shall be done on those days. Only what everyone must eat, that alone may be prepared for you. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread, and for on this very day I brought you your companies out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout your generations as a perpetual ordinance. All right, you notice that some of that's saying the same thing again. And in the first month, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, that's the week of Passover. Remember, Passover is a whole week. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days. No leaven shall be found in your houses, for whoever eats that leaven shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. I'm putting this up there so that you can see it's the same thing again, but the thing that we've added here is congregation. Good old priests, always talking about congregations. Whether an alien or native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your settlement you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, go, select lambs for your families, slaughter the Passover blood, take a bunch of hyssop. Remember, that shows up on Jesus when he's at the cross. That word hyssop shows up like 2 places in all the Bible. Dip it in the blood that's in the basin and touch it to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts with the blood in the basin. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood of the lintel on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your house and to strike you down. You shall observe this rite as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. This is the part that I think I really wanted you to get to here. When you come to the land the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this observant. And when your child asks you, what do you mean by this observance? Why do we have to go to church? My tie's itchy, right? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed down and worshiped. Chapter 12 is written for future generations to remember that God simultaneously can keep us safe, but also challenges us to not become complacent in the empire. That's really important. All right, there are 3 themes that we've missed so far that I want to catch back up on that happen in this story. And I'm going to do this quickly. The first one is darkness. In the book of Revelation, they call it the dark night of the soul. But whenever darkness shows up, and I won't say that. Darkness shows the weakness of Pharaoh, because in the light of day, Pharaoh's all dressed up. He's fancy schmancy. He's sitting on his throne, right? He's got those guards with cat heads or whatever, standing by his throne. There's gold and all the ornate, and he's got soldiers, and he can tell people where to go, and they can see and they can follow his bidding because it's daytime. But at night, he's just another dude in bed in the dark. When he's sleeping, he's not special. And that's where he's very vulnerable, because as a parent, there's nothing scarier than darkness. All the crazy crap that happens to kids always happens at night. Isn't that true, Mandy? I don't understand. How does that always happen? But they always get sick at night. For some reason, it just always goes downhill at night. And it's so vulnerable. And the nighttime is so vulnerable for all of us. And yet, in that night, God can see the difference between blood on a doorpost or not. It's like God senses who's sacrificing and who's not. God senses who is the chosen and who's not. So darkness becomes a really an important thing here, because Pharaoh's son dies in darkness, and then something else happens. Firstborn. Firstborn is a really important part of the story, because God says through Moses that Israel is his firstborn. And yet, in the beginning of Exodus, Pharaoh decrees that all of the firstborns of the Israelites will be killed. And yet, karma's a B word, right? There's a reversal of fortune, which actually shows he has no power, right? Because the midwives refuse to carry out his bidding, and yet God has power, and God kills Pharaoh's firstborn, which is also super sad. I mean, that's not a theology that I would particularly ascribe to, and I hope you wouldn't either. God says Israel's his firstborn, but he's willing to kill Pharaoh's firstborn. And then we find out that it's actually Pharaoh's firstborn that is his weakness, right? Because all of these other plagues, if they happen over 10 years, it's when his firstborn dies that he finally says, get out of here. Not just, I'm going to let you go, but I am going to push you out. That's the language that has, I'm going to throw you out of my kingdom. That's the language that's used there. And also, firstborns are the ones who inherit land. So when the firstborn dies, the land becomes more equally distributed to other people, rather than a firstborn male taking everything. Now the family has another way of dividing up wealth. And we know that most wealth and most power does not come to us through our hard work, as much as we'd love to tell that narrative. It is passed down from one powerful generation to the next. And that's what we use when we talk about things like institutionalized racism. If you look at all of the property in the United States, the vast majority of it is owned by white people. And 100 years from now, the vast majority of it will be owned by white people. That is systemic racism. It has very little to do with what you say to somebody on the street. It has so much more to do with where the power resides. And when we transfer power from one generation to the next, who do we transfer it to but to the people who look and sound like us? And that's about us fulfilling our legacy. And yet, God, in this story, this storied version of God, is acting in a way to dissolve that power structure from Egypt, so much so that it breaks Pharaoh's hardened heart. And when it breaks Pharaoh's heart, he gives in. And then this crazy thing happens. By the way, I do Google image searches for all of this, right? And I usually come up with medieval pictures of paintings, okay? But when you Google search the blessing of Pharaoh, or Pharaoh's blessing by Moses, or Moses appearing to Pharaoh, or Exodus 12, you never find a picture of Moses blessing Pharaoh. How many of you knew that this story was in here? Yeah, Anne's like, the things that I've forgotten are numerous as the sands of the sea. At midnight, all of this bad stuff happened to Pharaoh. And there was a loud cry in Egypt. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. Couldn't wait till morning, the same night that his son died. And he said, rise up, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord, as you said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone. And also bring a blessing upon me. How many of you knew that was here in Exodus? No. That's super sad. That is a super sad story of a repentant character in this narrative. The want for a blessing comes in the form of somebody asking forgiveness, right? When we forgive people, we set them free. We also set ourselves free when we forgive somebody. But we're trying to give them a place to start over. And it's the same language that showed up at the end of Genesis when Jacob was wrestling with God. And he says, I won't let go until you bless me. It's the same story being played out here. I want you to go, Moses, but first, bless me. I think that's really powerful. Of course, there's another story. It involves blood and bread and Passover and freedom and new life and the firstborn and darkness and blessing. And it happened in the celebrating of Passover on the night that he was betrayed. On that night, he got all of his friends together, and they went into a borrowed upper room. And in that upper room, he told the story of Passover. He told the story about blood and about bread. And yet he told it also in a new way. But in it, he had that we should believe and fear God, and that we should be prepared to revolt. And that tonight might be our last meal together. And in it, he took bread, and after he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat." He gives them a sense of urgency that this is the last time we'll be together. And he talks about how God will be leading them to freedom. If you read John's gospel, there's so much language about I abide in you and you abide in me, and the Father's the tree and I am the branches, and I'm in you and you're in me. And as you eat of this bread, you eat of my body. And as you drink this blood, you drink my blood. This is a, new covenant. For you to participate in what God is doing here, which somehow still seems to simultaneously mean safety and adventure. When we celebrate Holy Communion, we are telling the same story of how God saves us from our sin, from our slavery, from our complacency, and God invites us into a new story, a new creation, a new communion, where we will be challenged to stand up for what is right and to continue to live into God's redeeming love for all the world. So, sisters and brothers, this story of Passover is not just an ancient one. It's a perpetual one, which is why perpetually, every year, we tell the same story again and again. And it's really interesting to note that while they were once enslaved and then came to the promised land, sometime after that, they are taken over by another empire and another empire and another empire. And then the Gospel of Luke opens in the time of Herod, when Quirinius was governor over Syria, right? This whole thing about how we are no longer free. Everyone has to go to their hometown in order to register. By the way, it's a big bummer for your work if you have to go all the way to the place you were born, right, to be registered, so that they could collect taxes. All of that and the beginning of the Gospel of Luke is to remind you of the slavery of the oppressive empire. And then in Matthew's Gospel, in the very beginning, we find this great lineage of how Jesus is related to all of these powerful and cool women throughout history, and there's some guys in there too. Nobody really cares about them. And then right after that story, there's a prophecy about how Jesus is going to grow up and he's going to be the Messiah. And there's an angry and bitter king. And he says, "Go to Bethlehem and kill all of the firstborn males." And Jesus, because his dad, Joseph, has a dream, escapes where? To Egypt. Sisters and brothers, these stories continue to tell themselves in our lives. We find ourselves somewhere between the downtrodden and the ones who are oppressing others. We are always fluctuating in between safety and adventure. We always find ourselves needing forgiveness and also freedom. We always find ourselves needing to rely on God and understand that our place in God's kingdom is to fear and love God. And when we tell the story, we find that we are the person in the story who relies on God. And when we do that, and we do it as a community, we know that we can build God's kingdom. And that happens through the sharing of our own stories of liberation and freedom and forgiveness and new creation. And I pray that you, when you get your communion, whatever service that might be at, that you realize you're sharing in something that is both ancient and present, that is the old covenant and the new covenant. So, thanks for coming out tonight, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a great night. See you next time.